Welcome to the 8 Steps to Financial Fitness with Old Mutual. My name is Sachaba Gleba and I'm your host. So in last week's workshop, we spoke to Fawaz about responsible investing. This week, we're speaking to Melissa Moore, who is an investment analyst at Futuregrowth. Melissa, welcome.
Thanks, Trevor.
All right, so we're speaking about being an activist with your money.
Yeah, so I think, it's all good and well to save and invest for your own future. But what we want to encourage people to do is to consider the impact that their investments have on the future of the world around them. So, the same way that someone might support or boycott brands based on what they know about a company, what they've read about them in the media, we want to encourage people to consider who they're supporting with their investments. So you don't want your money invested in a company that exploits their laborers or is a huge emitter of greenhouse gases. So we want people to consider where their money is invested.
But what is investor activism?
So investor activism refers to the actions taken by investors to engage their investee companies around both financial and non-financial issues. They can do this by, public campaigns, attending companies' annual general meetings or AGMs, and voting on key matters or being vocal about key issues, or proposing shareholder resolutions to deal with important financial and ESG issues. So ESG issues being environmental, social, and governance issues.
I heard that in Fawaz's workshop, so I remember it. But a day-to-day person is thinking, how do I then do my research and back companies by becoming an activist? How does one go about doing that?
So for most people, we don't invest directly in the stock market. So most people's money is invested with asset managers. So these asset managers are custodians of large amounts of people's wealth that are invested with them either through unit trust investments or through their pension funds. And so that's where it's really the asset manager's responsibility to be an activist with your money. And as the custodians of these large amounts of money, asset managers essentially hold the key to keeping your investments accountable to higher environmental, social, and governance standards. And they most likely also have more ability to influence corporates' behavior than the average man on the street, given the large pools of money that they sort of manage on their clients' behalf.
And what are these types of investor activisms?
So you get two different types of investor activism, depending on what type of investor you are. So as a shareholder, you'd be a shareholder activist. And shareholders, by buying shares in a company, essentially become part owners of that business. And what that means is that when the company does well, they benefit from dividends or the capital appreciation in the value of the shares. But as a part owner of a business, you then also responsible for ensuring that this company is a good corporate citizen. So that goes to how they treat their laborers, how they impact society, how they impact the environment. And I think shareholders are increasingly realizing that it's not just about financial returns. It's also about the long-term sustainability of the company and the impact on society and the world around them. And shareholders have various mechanisms to influence corporates' behavior. So although most companies' decisions are really made by the management or the board of directors, there are certain things that shareholders can vote on. And even if you don't have enough shares to necessarily meaningfully change the outcome of a shareholder vote, you can still attend the annual general meeting or the AGM and be vocal about key matters, ask the hard questions, and that way you also encourage other stakeholders to think about things, beyond just financial metrics, but also, the impact that the company, as I said, is having on society or the environment and so on. And I think this is more important if a shareholder identifies practices of the company that are unsustainable or harmful or against the practices of good corporate governance. Then it's really upon the shareholder to sort of ask the hard questions. And I think an interesting example of shareholder activism is actually recently in 2019, Standard Bank became the first South African company to pass a climate-related resolution. And that was brought to them by shareholder activists. And so they then needed to publish their policy around funding coal-fired power plants or coal mining operations. So I think that's a really nice example of shareholder activism. And as I mentioned, there are two different types. And the other one is bondholder activism. So a bond is essentially like an IOU or a loan, and the bond investor would advance money to a investee, which can either be a company or government or state-owned entity that will then use that money for either running their business or for sort of large projects like building roads or building railways or building schools or renewable energy projects. And this is really like a win-win because the investor gets a better return than if their money was just invested in a bank. The investee receives money for their projects that they wouldn't have otherwise had access to. And we as society should ultimately benefit through better infrastructure, through the schools that are built, and through job creation in this process. But of course, as bondholders, we have a responsibility to advance this money to not just companies that are going to be creditworthy in terms of their ability to repay the money, but also companies that are good corporate citizens, or governments that are well run, that are transparent, that are having a good impact on society, the environment, and all of that. And so we as bondholders have a responsibility to engage our investee companies the same way that shareholders have. So even though we don't own shares in the company and we therefore can't vote on how the company is run, we as bondholders, if we're giving people large amounts of money, we can surely influence their corporate behavior. And there are many ways we can do this. So the one way is that we can vote with our feet. So we can essentially decide to walk away from investing or buying bonds of companies or governments that we believe or we have issues with.
Okay.
Another form or another way that we can be bondholder activists is by pushing for more strict terms in the underlying loan agreements. So those terms should promote better transparency, promote good corporate governance, or promote better investor rights, or outright prohibit the company or the government from doing certain things. So an example here would be a South African investor buying a state-owned entity's bonds, but on the condition that they adopt a politically exposed persons policy or a conflicts of interest policy to prevent, the entity from kind of just doing business with their friends and family, for example. And we can also engage with management and with board of directors to kind of deal with issues as they come up. And if that fails, we can engage the public, and we can use social media or traditional forms of media to kind of raise awareness around key issues that we feel the public needs to be aware of.
I love it. And I think what you're talking about is how being involved is actually the main thing here.
Yes.
Making sure you're understanding where your money goes and how you can stand for issues that you're passionate about via what you're investing in. So let's think of myself, for instance. I don't have massive investments, but what's the little bit that I can do in my role to make sure that I am being an activist with regards to the investments that I have?
So I think that probably comes to who you choose as your asset manager. So, when you're choosing an asset manager, you can choose somebody that's got a responsible investing mandate,
okay,
or an ESG mandate. And, if you're already invested in a unit trust, for example, or you've got a pension fund, you can actually challenge your asset manager and sort of challenge them on how ESG factors are considered in their investment processes. And if you've got a unit trust investment, you could look at the statement and consider your top sort of 20 holdings in your fund. And think about whether you've seen anything negative about them in the media. And if so, you could then go to your asset manager and say, hey, how have you considered ESG factors in making this investment decision? So, I think there are various ways that you could hold your investment asset manager sort of accountable. And then, in your personal capacity, you can also be an activist with your money by sort of considering which brands you support.
So doing your
as a
research
consumer,
as opposed to just jumping in and just investing for the sake of it.
Yeah. So when it comes to investments, you could kind of consider the mandate of the fund and not just the financial track record, but then I think also as a consumer, you're empowered to sort of make responsible decisions about who you support in terms of where you buy your groceries or where you buy your clothes. Consider ESG issues around all of the companies that you support in your personal capacity as well.
I think you really have knuckled it down in terms of how one can be an activist. We don't really think about these things, but if someone is watching the video, what are the top 3 things you'd hoping they'd take from this conversation?
So I think that you're a lot more empowered than you think you are to sort of make a difference. People think that to be an activist, you need to kind of do
be
grand,
out on the streets.
Yes. Massive gestures. And I think you can actually be conscious about, where you invest your money, where you spend your money. And you have the right as an investor in a unit trust or in a pension fund to actually ask the hard questions. We don't need to be passive kind of investors. We can actually, even the man on the street that's just got a pension fund, you can ask the trustee of your workplace pension fund the hard questions and hold them accountable as the custodians of your wealth.
Thank you so much, Melissa. That was very educational.
Thank you.
All right, I can't believe we've gone through 8 steps of financial fitness to freedom with Old Mutual. I've loved hosting you. We've started with setting goals. We went right through to thinking like a boss. We went right through to being an activist with your money, setting up an emergency fund. I hope you've loved each and every one of these workshops. But most importantly, I hope you forgive yourself for all the mistakes that you made financially in 2020 and move forward because you will know better. Remember, we're linking this to physical fitness. If you're on a physical fitness journey, you take it one day at a time, which is precisely what you need to do in this brand new year. I've loved being your host, and I hope you are enlightened and educated. Much love.